Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Alright, second roundup of 2024, focusing on the second third of the year. You know the usual drill by now. Got another typically meaty list of 32 releases on the docket. I'll be real, the first half of this year admittedly hasn't offered a lot of stuff that grabbed me to the point of being longer-term keepers. I think only like 2 albums I covered in the last roundup have stuck with me enough where they felt like they could be proper year-end list contenders, and Moby of all people tenuously holding on to my top spot at the mid-year was a little worrying. But now the year might finally be starting to pick up a bit more steam. Maybe not necessarily from the more recognizable names who I feel like I might be a bit more harsher to in this video. Pretty much all the quality came from my usual random Bandcamp diving and finding artists I'd never heard of. Make sure not to skip over the albums I scored in the mid-higher 7 range. There'll be a lot of really interesting stuff to find here that I think deserves more attention. In fact, I'm going to start this roundup talking about 2 artists who sent in their own albums to me via the $10 tier on my Patreon page, and I thought delivered enough quality for me to want to directly highlight in this roundup, so how about we get into that? Oh yeah, and as per usual, if you're interested in finding out my favorite and least favorite tracks on any given project mentioned in this video, you can find the usual paste bin document linked in the description. Anyway, let's get started with, from Orkun A, Archaic. So, first off, I'm going to highlight this remarkably solid ambient project coming out of this small-time artist based in Turkey. In one breath, this won't necessarily be the kind of thing that might stick out from the usual expectations of this genre if I were to just describe it on paper. It's clearly taking some inspiration from the likes of, like, Tim Hecker's Harmony and Ultraviolet and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the actual execution really impressed me. A lot more of a feel-good listen than most Tim Hecker projects tend to be, with a lot of delicate modern classical influences. Additionally, I got the deluxe edition of this album, which added 3 bonus tracks that, in my opinion, significantly improved the album's pacing and sense of sonic variety, and all ended up being among some of my favorite tracks in the bunch. For more detailed thoughts, you can find the Patreon text post I wrote up on this album linked in the description, but yeah, this is really nice. If you're as much of an ambient fan as I am, I would definitely recommend giving this a shot. It's quite a bit more fulfilling a listen than I would have expected. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Antypica, Mirrors All the Way Down. The other project that really stuck out to me from the $10 Patreon requests and I wanted to shout out comes from this experimental artist from Georgia, the country, not the state. It's definitely one of the most ambitious records I've heard this year. The mix of well-polished experimental glitch elements and jazz influences within the framework of a David Lynch-inspired concept record is the kind of thing that gave me similar vibes to artists like Tipper, Cohen Sound, and Culprate. And those are not comparison points I make lightly. This was clearly the product of a lot of concerted effort and creativity with a really cool, unique sound. I did end up having more mixed thoughts on the way the concept itself was presented. There were a bunch of inclusions of stock sound effects and spoken monologues that ended up getting more distracting than anything. And the monologues in particular presented something of a cynical worldview that didn't entirely sit right with me. For the full analysis, you can again find the Patreon text post I wrote up linked in the description, but just the core sound of this one left me feeling like, regardless of my issues with those conceptual elements, this is the kind of project that really ought to be seeing more attention than it's currently getting. I can very easily see other people being able to get an even more meaningful experience out of it than I did while having none of the problems I did, so I'm definitely going to recommend this one highly to anyone to whom that might sound interesting. So yeah, I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on that one. Next up, from Multiples, 2 hours or something. Okay, and now we're getting into the proper bulk of the roundup, starting with one heck of a crossover that makes all the sense in the world, but I still would not have expected. Multiples is obviously a collab between Birmingham techno artist Anthony Child, aka Surgeon, and Netherlands techno artist Joachim Pop, aka Speedy J. Sorry for butchered pronunciations as per usual. Now, I'm mostly going to gloss over my thoughts on Surgeon for this segment, since I recently covered his last album Crash Recoil, including a mini and brief segment, quickly going through his his back catalog in the Volume 13 roundup. If you want more in-depth thoughts on him, you can go back and check that segment out. TLDR, he makes lots of solid, if extremely straightforward techno. My feelings on him are not complicated. But Speedy J was not an artist I was ever expecting to get the opportunity to talk about. There's a much more interesting conversation around that guy. He's been around since the very beginning of the 90s and was sort of an unsung IDM and ambient techno pioneer who contributed a full album to Warp Records' Artificial Intelligence album series and went on to evolve his sound significantly into more experimental and industrial techno territory before a point in the 2000s where he hung it up on making new full solo albums ever again. He never left the public eye. He stuck to DJing and releasing a lot of vinyl-only singles through his Store label. But getting a full album statement from this guy these days, collab or not, is an exceedingly rare occurrence. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to go back through that guy's back catalog. I had listened to all his solo albums way back when I was in college, around the time I first started up this channel, and initially fell in love with his debut album Ginger at the time, but I hadn't come back to most of his stuff in years, and I hadn't heard any of his other collab albums, so I thought, hey, I'm probably not going to get another better excuse to do this anytime soon. So I went back to refamiliarize myself with his old work, and here's my semi-quick thoughts on his discography so far. When I first listened through the entire Artificial Intelligence series many years ago, I initially pegged this album as my favorite out of all of them. It brought more playful and lighthearted edges and interesting textures to that series' trademark spacey ambient techno formulas that really helped it stand out initially. It didn't stay as my favorite in that series longer term. Nowadays I prefer Incunabula, and coming back to this now, it is more of an uneven background music-y listen than I remember, but there's still enough stellar moments here to easily cement it as great. This album pretty much focuses on the exact same sound and style as Ginger, but in direct contrast to that album, it was only pretty good back when I first heard it, and grew on me a lot when I came back to it for this segment. It's more serious than Ginger and not as loose or lighthearted, but it nails down its cinematic and semi-futuristic vibe better, and there's a bit more sonic variety here, from ambient cuts to acid house to breakbeat and more. Can also mark this one as great, at least on par with Ginger now. This was a big change of pace for him, showed him going into much more experimental territory in the vein of Autaker's Try Repeat. It's not as good an album as that one. There's a bunch of parts that just aren't that interesting or kind of run together, but it's still pretty good. It got its standout moments for sure. And this collab, which I already reviewed back when I did the odds and ends for music, kinda combines the style of Public Energy #1 with some of Mike Paradinas' melodic instincts for an especially weird and off-kilter experimental IDM project. It has shrunk on me since I first reviewed it. It requires a certain mood to fully get into it, but the best moments are still incredible. Oh yeah, he released 2 super minimal ambient albums under his real name for Pete Namlook's Fax label. They're fine. If you want 2 hours of stuff that sounds kind of like Autaker's Yolquin, then check those out. This continues off the style of Public Energy #1, but significantly improves upon it in almost every way. The production on this album is way more imposing and full-sounding, the industrial grooves go a lot harder, the ambience is a lot more immersive, it flows better as a complete whole, and the way it ends in that solo piano piece is stunning. Not a listen for the faint of heart, but I can also mark this as properly great. And as for his as-of-now final solo album, this marks another change in sound towards much more straightforward techno. Way less going on sonically than his previous albums, nothing but regular four-on-the-floor techno bangers, not unlike those you'd hear out of an artist like Surkin, incidentally. Like that guy's stuff, though, it's still easily danceable and well-crafted enough to be an enjoyable time, even if nothing revolutionary. Here's a collab he did with Pete Namlook, also under his own name. A lot less melodic than those other 2 projects he put out in the 90s, it's mostly atmospheric experimental glitch effects, but still pretty neat. Here's a collab he did with Chris Liebing, another collection of mildly glitchy industrial techno bangers in a similar vein to A Shocking Hobby. Good stuff. Here's a collab he did with Luca Mortellaro under the name Zeitgeber, another collection of loose amelodic experimental IDM workouts with more of an ambient focus like the Namlook collab, kind of went in one ear and out the other if I'm being honest. Here's a collab he did under his own name with Albert von Abe. It's kind of like the Zeitgeber album, except even less musical and pretty much just indistinct patterns of audio fuzz and machine noises. It exists, I guess. Which brings us to here. So yeah, it's been a very long time since we got a project with some proper meat on its bones out of Speedy J. I feel like the guy on average tended to be at his best when just working on his own, and a lot of those more recent collabs have been a lot flightier and less essential. But if you have been missing the days when he delivered full projects that had more bite to them, I think this latest one might finally be the one to do the trick for you. This album may not exactly be unfamiliar territory for either artist. Every track on this thing is a long-winded, unedited jam session of various experimental electronic effects and IDM beat work, in the same vein as Speedy J's most experimental work like Public Energy No. 1 in a Shocking Hobby, or Surgeon's most abstract IDM-centric work such as Breaking the Frame. But these mixes are a lot more intense and well-layered, with lots of different sounds flying past you on any given track. Each one has a sense of slower-paced evolution to it. It's basically the kind of material you might expect Outer to be putting out right now, in line with albums theirs like NTS Sessions and Plus. Now, those comparison points coming from me probably sounds like I ended up not really feeling this stuff, or possibly, respecting it more than enjoying it. Though, while I'd be lying if I said I didn't struggle with this project at all, it is as much of a difficult and heady listen as it probably sounds, and stretching over nearly 2 hours as the title suggests. I still feel like I had a fun time with it, and felt like I got enough of my fill of quality to come out satisfied. All these tracks' mixes of sounds are pretty high energy and exciting in spite of their frequent lack of traditional melodies, and there's a decent amount of variety in terms of the execution to make sure the record never totally runs together. Some of the earlier moments even do include some extremely thin melodies, like the pitched metallic clanking on Opener Minimum Space, or clanging synth imitation grandfather clock bells on Sounds Good to Me, or the almost trance-like synth builds on my personal favorite track Spirit, going over one of the most propulsive and exciting beat patterns on display here. There's a few tracks like Coffee Nerd and Walkie that have marginally more of a delicate and airy texture to their frantic and intensely fast-paced rhythms. There's tracks that get much heavier and more apocalyptic, like System Down and It's a Mindset, that fittingly have among the densest mixes here. But there's also tracks like the title track and The Dog's Name that lean away from the density and go for a bit more of a dark ambient influenced approach. And I feel like all of those different sides to the album sound come together on penultimate cut Train to Hoofddorp, which stretches over 15 minutes and fittingly probably has the most different evolutions and variety of sounds within its running time. Not to say that I wouldn't have minded this material being edited down further to tighten up the listen. Tracks like Rotterdam and a couple of other cuts I've already mentioned above can fall into the background for me without leaving as much of an impression. And there's also a track here called Wet Socks, which probably has the single most unpleasant mix of sounds, and also stretches over nearly 15 minutes. If there was any one track here that most made me feel the length on this thing, it was that one. This is very much the kind of project that's going to appeal to a very specific subset of people and probably won't be worth the time of others who wanted something more accessible. If that was what you were looking for, I might question why you'd be expecting to get it out of either of these two artists, but still, there's so much to dig into onto this release that I'm barely even scratching the surface on, that I imagine for the people who do really mess with this particular style, it's going to be an easy album of the year contender. I don't know if I'm keeping it around myself out of how intimidating it is and my predictably feeling pretty emotionally distant from it, as I often do for projects of this particular style, but I still generally had fun with it, even on the surface level. And again, there's plenty of further depths to be plumbed out of this that I don't have the spare time to get into. The people who are more into this freewheeling industrial IDM style than I am are going to really love this and get tons of longer term mileage out of it. So if that's your taste, absolutely make sure to check it out. I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Machinedrum, 3482.
Nah, diamond in the rough through all the pressure you gon'.
Machinedrum is not one of those artists that I ever know what to expect going into a new album of his. His style has gone in so many different places over the course of his career, to the point where albums like Rooms, Vapor City, Human Energy, and A View of You are barely even recognizable as the same artist. But I was kind of thrown off when I jumped into a new album of his to basically find a less memorable retread of his last record. This album, I suppose, differs from A View of You in the sense that it leans much harder on the guest vocalists than that one did. There's only one instrumental track on this album compared to the last album kind of splitting things half and half between instrumentals and vocal tracks. Well-polished liquid drum and bass, sharing time with dusty instrumental hip-hop with maybe a little garage on the side every now and then. At the very least, I do like that blend of sounds and influences, so I'll take the good tracks as they come. This album can admittedly be a bit hit and miss. There's a decent handful of cuts that just bounce off me without leaving any impression, or a couple that I can almost get behind but don't quite connect for me, like how I Like You was kind of derailed by its hook, which I found a little annoying, or Respect, which features a kind of creaky vocal performance from Topaz Jones that I didn't really care for. Also, that track strikes me as a very odd choice for functional album opener, a lot more of an off-kilter experimental hip-hop flavor to that one that, while I can respect, I think would have been more effective if placed later in the album. Still, the moments on this album that hit really freaking hit. Tracks like Weary with Mick Jenkins and Jesse Boykins III, or Heal with AK The Savior and De Niro Ferrar hit in kind of a similar way to his old track Cane Train, being these really smooth and soulful hip-hop cuts. Neither track bangs like Cane Train does, but they get a lot more introspective and emotional, and I really freaking like the way their samples sound and the way they integrate these dramatic pianos into their mixes. Those two are definitely my favorites here. I think Heal might be my favorite since it reminds me a little of the Avalanche's Take Care in Your Dreaming, but I don't know. There's several liquid drum and bass cuts that hit too, not just the sole instrumental cut Honey, but also Rise with Rosette and Zoom with Tinashe. They have some of the prettiest vocal performances on display here, and the instrumentals they go up against feel really bright and colorful. And I'll also say Kill You with Tanerelle is a nice little down-tempo R&B cut near the end that grew on me the more times I heard it. I kinda like the way her voice is stuttered and edited on the chorus. But yeah, that's about all 3 for 82 has to offer for me. Was I hoping for more out of it? Yeah, I can't say this reaches the heights of his best work for me, but at the same time there's no crime in not being another radical reinvention if there's still some good tunes to back it up, and Machinedrum was able to deliver enough of those for me to still say I enjoyed myself. Don't expect your mind to be blown, but it's a good time. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Pub, Process the Wise. Pub is a Scottish IDM artist who's regularly been added since the early 2000s, although I haven't heard any of the guy's other albums. I just picked this up on a random recommendation from a commenter. If you're looking for some very warm and friendly synth material in the vein of artists like Casino vs. Japan, Bogdan Rusinski, or certain specific Caribou albums, this might be for you. We got a lot of flighty Boards of Canada style electric piano melodies and hazy synth arpeggios, occasionally going over fuzzy beat work, but just as often remaining in beatless territory, all adding up to a very easily approachable vibe-centric listen. It's certainly very pretty, and the melodies do have a heartfelt enough tone for this record to be hard to dislike. But at the same time, I'd be lying if this actually stood out to me in any way. I've heard gazillions of melodic synth albums like these over the years, and by my ears there's very little unique personality to really separate Pub apart from the crowd. And very little variety on this album either. Everything feels like it was composed from loose improvisational jam sessions with little rhyme or reason to the way the melodies progress and kind of just flow wherever, let alone forming any kind of hooks or defined structure. There's a couple of moments I like, tracks like Resist the Escalator and Joyous that have neat evolutions over time, or Waves Across probably being the strongest cut here on the merit of being the closest track to having a hook in its lead arpeggios. But in terms of anything else to break down, that's about all I got. Again, it's hard to dislike. I did enjoy the vibe of it while it was on, and I could tell it came from a place of passion. I'm willing to believe that Pub may have an older record that I haven't heard that might be able to click with me more easily than this one, but yeah, beyond this album's pleasantly likable vibe, I'm not hearing much of actual substance to glean out of it. It's just alright, and I'm overall feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on it. Next up from Eliminate, Get Off the Internet. Thinking about you when I close my eyes. Alright, next recommendation is this California-based EDM artist. He got his start in the mid-2010s commercial dubstep scene, and has released stuff on labels like Disciple and Never Say Die. He's a big enough name to pull in names like Frost Children and Flux Pavilion for this album, although this is his debut as far as I can tell, and I'd personally never heard of the guy until I saw someone randomly recommend I check him out in my comments. I have not heard anything else he's made. I will say this was a decent enough listen for what it was. In one breath, I do think the production is really clean and well polished and sounds really nice and expansive. And the guy's got a good ear for melodies. All of these tracks have really solid tunes to back themselves up. And while EDM releases in this vein can occasionally be hit and miss when it comes to how they decide to structure their drops, maybe with the exception of the drop on the track Heart.exe being a little annoying, there wasn't anything that really bothered me in that vein either. Just a standard selection of modern bass music with stabby rhythm drops and the like. There's even a few moments that feel like if Porter Robinson tried to make liquid drum and bass. The best cut here is the one with Flex Pavilion and Mish, called Dawn. Again, just sounds really nice. Similar feelings on cuts like Playing with Fire, the not really ambient closer Happy Ending, and the track More Power was a really strong banger too with some acid synths. As for why this album is only decent for me and not necessarily good, that mainly comes down to the lyrics, which range from annoyingly brainless to insufferably emo without any kind of substance. I mean, at least unlike the last Porter Robinson thing, this project was never trying to say anything profound in the first place and isn't trying to pass itself off as anything other than what it is. This is not a genre that has ever required much of any thought in this department, and I'm typically more forgiving of stupid lyrics on an EDM album like this than I would be for most other genres. I just think a lot of these hooks and refrains get to a level of inanity that starts to enter into actively annoying territory. Tracks like Ego Trip, with all these squeaky voices telling me to take it to another level, or the opener Think About It telling me to think about this and think about that without any further clarification of what this or that are. Well, those aren't too bad. But much more glaringly, you got the title track featuring all these cutesy, pitched-up female vocals repeatedly calling you a stupid idiot for still being on the internet. Just really beating into your head that you, the listener, are a stupid idiot. Or the track Fuck You, which is just this really angelically beautiful mix of warm synth pads and harmonized choruses of vocalists repeatedly crooning, "Fuck you, suck my dick." The vocal delivery on that one is so earnest and heartfelt sounding that I genuinely cannot tell whether that track was meant to be an intentional joke or is just that emo without any self-awareness, but still had me absolutely fucking dead either way. Oh, and of course we can't forget the track Poison Oak, which prominently features the band I Set My Friends on Fire screaming all over it. And if you know anything about that band, I don't think I need to elaborate any further. I mean, I suppose it could have been worse. It could have featured Falling in Reverse instead. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Get Off the Internet. It's fine. It's brain-rottingly inane, but it's never boring, and it all sounds really nice, so if that sounds like it interests you, then check it out, I guess. I'll let it off with a 6.3 out of 10. Next up from Llyr, Dichromanticism EP. Alright, Llyr. This guy made one of my favorite albums of 2021 when he put out his debut album, Biome, a fascinating, ecologically themed IDM concept record that split itself between an ambient half and a techno half, and built itself entirely out of processed field recordings he took while in the forests of Borneo. If you haven't heard that album yet, it is still excellent and worth going back to. And I was definitely curious to see how he might follow a project like that up. With this new EP, it seems he's stripping away a lot of the more abstract and conceptual sides to his sound in order to focus more on the core fundamentals of who he is as a producer, trying to make sure that he can still deliver quality dance music that doesn't rely on a really out-of-the-box concept in order to get your attention. And while that unsurprisingly means I didn't like this as much as Biome, and it doesn't give me even close to as much to say, I do think he succeeded in exactly what he set out to do here. The best tracks from Biome were the more straightforward techno bangers on that album's second half, like Intrusion No. 509 or Encroachment, and this EP focuses specifically on the sound delivered by tracks like those. Just making really nice, hyper-polished and hard-hitting techno with super satisfying beat work, thick danceable bass lines, and very metallic but still decently colorful melodic textures. And it all just bangs! Highlights include the title track, which had a lot of really cool acidy textures and some of the best melodies, Hypernormalcy, which gets more thuddingly percussive and heavy than any other track here, and of course the single beatless track, I Wrote This to Make You Feel Something, which lets those melodies take center stage and did in fact succeed in making me feel something, though all 5 tracks here are really good. Not much else to say, check this out. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Nonkeen, All Good? Okay, Nonkeen is an electronic jazz trio consisting of Niels Fromm and his childhood friends Frederick Gemeiner and Sebastian Singvald. This is actually their 3rd album together. They put out 2 projects back in 2016 called The Gamble and Oddments of the Gamble, which sounded cool from what I've previewed through, although I haven't properly sat with enough to form actual thoughts. I've only given a full attention listen to this new one. I'm gonna be honest, I just found out about the existence of this band through Bandcamp Daily article and thought, damn, Nils Fromm playing in a jazz band context? That's gotta be worth hearing. And yeah, this whole project was really dang nice. Apparently the album is written as a tribute to a 60s German jazz composer, Herbert Lázár, who pioneered a specific style of electronic jazz called laser jazz, and all the track titles are apparently directly taken from an interview of Lázár where he says, "I'm sure that love will never be a product of plasticity." Although for whatever reason I can't find out any more info on the internet about said composer beyond social media posts from the label made about this particular album, which is kinda weird, but never mind that. Point is that if you just want a really nice, warm and fuzzy and emotionally resonant collection of open-end jazz compositions featuring Nils Fromm's easily recognizable keyboard work, this album will be worth hearing. Highlights include tracks like That Love and Will Never for being among the warmest emotional moments that include lots of really nice and airy keyboards and jazz drumming. Definitely feels like the kind of material that's paying tribute to someone who has long since passed away. The track Be makes for a welcome burst of energy with some stronger bass lines and neat synth arpeggios. The closer Mark mirrors a lot of the same melodies and energy as that track, but stretches them out to a more epic and expansive 11 minutes, and makes for a really strong and climactic finish, probably my favorite cut here. And I also really like Exclamation, which is an entirely ambient drone synth odyssey, breaks up the sound of the project pretty effectively. Not to say it's perfect, the album doesn't have the most striking of openers in the arpeggio-centric opener, I'm sure, and strangely the weakest moment for me was also the longest track, Product, for just kind of meandering and not really having any interesting instrumental textures or melodic flares that really stuck out to me in context. But even with that in mind, this album was just really freaking nice all around. If you're a Nils Fromm fan and missed out on this, that'll definitely be worth remedying. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Suzi Analogue, ONEZ. Suzi Analogue is an electronic and hip-hop producer from LA who's been in the game since the late 2000s. She's collaborated with artists like Toki Monsta, Knowledge, Quelle Chris, RP Boo, among many others. This project includes collabs with Jalen and Blue. She's run a label called Never Normal Records since 2014, according to her website. She's also a member of the Recording Academy and is a voter for the Grammys. Pretty dang well connected, it seems. I'd personally never heard of her until 2022 when she released a compilation called Infinite Zones of various older material she'd made throughout the years that got highlighted in Bandcamp Daily. It was a decently solid collection of classic footwork and juke material, although it didn't stick out to me enough at the time where I felt compelled to cover it. So now she's got another new mixtape here to follow that comp up. A mix of both old tracks, going back as far as 2019, alongside some new unreleased ones. And personally, I had a lot more fun with this project than I did with Infinite Zones. There's a lot more variety going on here, and the ideas going into it just felt more striking to me. There are still tracks that deliver the same footwork and juke sounds you'd expect. Tracks like Go-Go with Nappy Nappa or Work Experience that just go really hard in that particular vein. Or Kieres, which uses one of the same samples J Dilla used on Donuts and spins it into something way more visceral and club-friendly. I suppose there's also the track with Jalen as well, although that one was actually kind of a letdown. Pretty bare bones and drab arrangement that isn't nearly as interesting as most of the stuff Jalen did on her new album earlier this year. But there's also tracks here like Changed, that takes those same frameworks and makes something more expansive and epic out of it, evolving through a handful of different sampled hooks over the course of its 7.5 minutes. There's tracks that have more of an R&B flavor like Conversation Starter or Wild Blend. The latter brings in some reggaeton influences and is apparently a mashup of two different old tracks of hers, including one that was on Infinite Zones. There's Can We Acid Techno Uzi Flip, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's an acid techno remix of the classic 90s R&B track originally by SWV. There's also the track with Blue for more of a gritty hip-hop flavor. He doesn't really have anything to say, but he sounds cool over that instrumental. There's Slow, which is a halftime cut that features all these cascading breakbeats and bright and colorful synths that sound really nice and remind me a little of high-tech jazz by Underground Resistance. And I will say the two ambient-leaning cuts at the very end and Never Normalize and Watch Me Jump Axis version do make for a bit of an anticlimax finish to this thing, and neither is all that notable or interesting, outside of the latter having a lot of samples of what sounds like kids yelling and screaming on a playground, which weren't my thing. Though I suppose I don't mind seeing these cuts being here either, since they further prove her versatility. Overall, yeah, this project is a really fun time. If you're just looking for some authentic, classic-style underground club bangers with lots of different flavors and genre combinations, then make sure to give this a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Saishi, Death of Mishima. Saishi is not a Japanese artist, but rather the vaporwave-centered alias for Italian ambient composer Emanuele Ligori. He's one of the more frequent contributors to Lee Norris's Neo Tantra label, and has also released projects on the label under the names Buried Marie and Sad Graffiti. I did kind of pick this project up on a whim, thinking the album cover looked cool, though I didn't necessarily have any kind of special expectations for it. Last year I'd also heard another project he put out under the same alias called Tomorrow, which I found to be a pretty unremarkable blend of ambient and vaporwave influences that made for nice background music, but not much else. However, this album, Death of Mishima, is legit great and might end up as one of my favorites of the whole year. If you've been pining for the days of vaporwave's peak of relevance a decade ago, or have some nostalgia for artists like 2814 and Hong Kong Express before the latter kind of disappeared up his own ass, this is gonna be the album for you. There's not that much in the way of actual sampling here. This is vaporwave made mostly out of original synth-backed material, a la 2814. But it's got all those classic Blade Runner-y vapor aesthetics, and the melodies and atmosphere created by all of it is absolutely stunning. Lots of warm analog synth arpeggios going up next to all these expansive ambient atmospheres made out of melted down, airy female vocals. Melodically, every track on this thing feels like it's making variations on the same kind of motifs over and over, although the way each one kind of develops on those motifs feels distinct, and the way they all come together almost makes the whole thing feel kind of like some sort of vaporwave instrumental musical theater piece. And they all find different sonic textures to set themselves apart, too. The brighter arpeggios and vibraphones going over the opener, which translates to Listen to the Wind singing, or very similar melodies finding new spins and focuses on track 2, the title track, or track 4, Close Your Eyes and Pray. There's tracks that focus more on the ambient side without much of a pulse, seen on track 3, Barcode, featuring field recordings of a grocery store checkout, and reminded me of that one Groceries album that made the rounds on Bandcamp back in the day. Or given much more of an expansive and full-bodied sound on track 7, There's Nothing But Rubble. And the best tracks are probably the two that have titles readable in English. 2080 takes a turn for a bit more of an electro-tinged cyberpunkish sound and has more bite and aggression to it than any other track here. And Rain Translation builds itself around some very pretty cascading piano progressions. Also there's the closer, A Journey You Can't Return From, Goodbye, which, while one of the more stripped-back 70s style synth compositions here, still makes for the perfect natural emotional culmination of the whole album. Not every moment on this album is as interesting as the next. The second half was stronger for me than the first, and one could look at a project like this and see irony in the fact that vaporwave, a genre based in the aesthetics of nostalgia, is now being looked at as a source of nostalgia in itself, with an album like this paying such specific homage to what that scene started. But when the result clearly has so much heart put into it, is this well constructed and is this effectively able to pull at those emotional heartstrings, occasionally even true to the title seeming like it's mourning the death of someone you loved? I gotta give this a high recommendation. Great album. I'm feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Galantis, RX. Galantis' debut album Pharmacy was the first album I ever reviewed on this channel, and their personal meaning to me ends there and goes absolutely no further. They did make serviceable enough super pop-friendly mainstream EDM back in the old days and had a couple of good songs like Forever Tonight, Runaway You and I, No Money, among others, but I don't really care about them outside of that. The only reason they were the topic of my first review is because they were a high-charting name at the time that I didn't see anyone else covering, and the album being so dead simple with so little to analyze felt like a good easy start as someone who'd never presented a review on camera before. There was never anything super special about them as far as mainstream EDM went. They relied very heavily on chipmunk vocals that significantly soured on me as I got older. From their second album, The Aviary onwards, they were pretty shamelessly chasing the commercial trends of their time, even though I remember that album technically being an improvement on their debut. And I haven't felt compelled to go back and re-listen to any of their stuff in many years. They even dropped a third album, Church, in 2020, and I just skipped it altogether. Just didn't feel any obligation to give it the time of day, and I don't think anyone even requested I cover it. I'm sure someone probably did, but I don't care. Still, when one day I saw this new fourth album of theirs performing decently well on iTunes, I got morbidly curious once again to see what they might be up to. My expectations for this thing were pretty much in the toilet, especially when I saw there was a track called Bang Bang My Neurodivergent Anthem, which from the title alone gave me a really bad feeling. A commercial EDM act like them is way out of their depth trying to make a song about neurodivergence. Or from the fact that 3 tracks on this album featured David Guetta of all people. Yes, 3 David Guetta features for an album in 2024. Holy shit. I jumped into this album expecting some kind of ear-bleeding train wreck to poke fun at. Although it turns out this album was merely mediocre and not the worst thing ever. Honestly, I probably enjoy this equally as much as I currently enjoyed their debut. So, not good, but hardly irredeemable. Chances are, if you still enjoy their previous work, you'll enjoy this as well. Hell, the Neurodivergent song wasn't even as objectionable as I expected. It's still not good and doesn't have anything insightful to say about neurodivergence. Shocker. The basic-ass lyrics comparing brains to bullets because they go really fast and the heart is a trigger. It's got all the depth and sympathy of an ad agency trying to pander to a demographic, but I suppose it's at least not delivering any outright insulting or dehumanizing messages a la Sia's music. Nor is it trying to pass a disability off as a superpower like I was much more expecting them to do, so extremely low bars cleared, I guess. No, the real worst part about this album is just the same thing that I've always found most annoying about Galantis over the years, and that's just the chipmunky vocal processing. A bunch of these tracks like Koala, 6 Feet Down, and especially Fool For You continue to be the most irritating shit ever. Although in the latter case, I guess it wasn't so much the filtering or pitching as it was the stuttering of the hook that got on my nerves. I'm a fool for you. That was fucking dreadful. Even on some tracks that didn't have any vocal pitching, like Dream Team with Neon Trees, still had really awful compression and filtering that I couldn't get behind. Whole albums produced like we're still in 2014. But to be fair, there are actual good tracks here, if they're able to keep the chipmunk filters to a minimum and lean on the strength of the disco house instrumentals, like on 1, 2, and 3, or Side Effects, or Little Bit Yours. They're a lot easier to get into. I do like the addition of disco string sections on like half the tracks here. Hell, astonishing as it might be to say, having David Guetta on board turned out to be more of a benefit than I ever would have expected. Since his productions always have to appeal even more to the lowest common denominator and have even less personality than Galantis, that means he's paradoxically able to get them away from their most annoying impulses. He's nice enough to not even bring in any of his thuddingly on-the-nose samples that have featured on his most recent hits. Well, I guess the closer on this thing, Heartbreak Anthem with Little Mix, that one still sucked and had all these crowd voices that got on my nerves, but the other 2 tracks he featured on, Damn You Got Me Saying with MNEK and Lighter with 5 Seconds of Summer, were actually pretty decent. Just straightforwardly danceable pop house tunes that were likable enough. So that was a pleasant surprise. I don't know if I could say I personally enjoyed this album much. There's far too many tracks here that I found like instantly cringeworthy from the first second they start, and the misses outnumber the hits for me. Also, the datiness of everything hits an odd note for me and not a nostalgic one, but if you were already a fan of Galantis, this will just give you more of what you enjoyed in their work before and leave you as satisfied as any other project of theirs. This isn't my thing right now, but the 2015 version of me who could still tolerate this kind of harsh vocal pitching probably would have messed with it. For better or worse, this is an album that's going to reconfirm whatever feelings you already had on this duo and not change anyone's mind on them, and yeah, I'm overall feeling a 5.7 out of 10 on it. It's fine. Next up from James Devane, Searching. Okay, this was an album I heard about through Vale Smith's Big Mid-Year video. He compared it to Orkun A, and even if I'm more lukewarm on Orkun A than most, I still thought that might be up my alley. And yeah, this turned out to be a fun time. I can definitely hear the comparison with albums like Colonial Patterns and Plunk, but the comparison point that would have come to my mind first is Thomas Fellman's work with The Orb, like Okie Dokie It's The Orb on Compact and that kind of stuff. A lot of very dubby, abstract ambient techno with some very stodgy and thick but colorful mixes of sounds. And it's decently well varied too. There's cuts that have more of a spacier and dancier edge to them, like Kilter and Last Strut. There's one track entirely of blubbering synth chords called Bottom Dweller. There's cuts that have a much more chill and jazzier lo-fi hip-hop influence to them, like No More No Less, Lights Down Low, or Maybe Tomorrow. Really like how the latter smoothly evolves through a bunch of different phases. A bunch of tracks add like an extra fraction of a beat to each measure, like an off-sync tape loop as well, such as Vast Sky and a bunch of the other tracks I've already mentioned. The album does have a bit of a weirdly sour ending, and well, ending. I wouldn't have personally chosen to end this, such an otherwise pleasant album in a much darker and edgier sounding cut like that. Both a little out of place and ends in an abrupt hard cut. Could have been placed elsewhere in the album and worked more effectively. Also, the 7 different searching interludes, which are all like 5 seconds each of tape manipulation sounds, don't really add anything of substance, but yeah, other than that, I had a fun time with this project. Lots of cool abstract sounds and pleasant vibes. Grew on me the more time I heard it. Can definitely give my thumbs up to this thing. Might even hang on to it, we'll see. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Scooter, Open Your Mind and Your Trousers. One of my regular Patreon supporters suggested I check this one out offhand. Scooter is a German happy hardcore band who's been around since the mid-90s. They've been through loads of lineup changes over the years, but their current lineup is lead vocalist H.P. Baxter, producer and keyboardist Mark Blau, and producer and keyboardist Jay Frog. This is their 21st studio album to date, although I was told sitting through their full catalog might not be entirely worth my time, and this new album would be a sufficiently indicative look at what they're about. So I haven't heard anything else they've done outside of this album. Feel free to suggest your favorite albums I have to check out if you're a big fan of theirs. Anyway, yeah, this was definitely an interesting listen. I'm gonna be honest, happy hardcore just as a whole genre has never really been my particular cup of tea. This is a style that can get really annoying really fast if I'm not in a specific mood. The techno and trance instrumentals on this album are very well polished and ready-made to get a full stadium of people hyped. Though you better be ready for a lot of super high-pitched chipmunk samples, occasional blaring Eurodance leads, and or pounding drops with hardstyle kicks or gabber or whatever related genre that is. I've never liked any instance of that one texture of distorted kick drum that shows on a bunch of tracks here, such as Rave and Shout or Waste Your Youth, among others. You know the one. Though I suppose if you're looking for some classic style late 90s, early 2000s style club bangers, these guys are able to deliver plenty of those. There were just as many instrumentals that I did mess with, tracks with hooks that weren't annoying, like Children of the Rave, Sun Comes Back Around, or Constellations. And 2 tracks that don't even feature any vocals at all and just deliver really straightforward techno grooves in ARDRHU and Avoid Rivals. Those were a nice addition. Of course, though, I'm kind of dancing around what is probably the element of Scooter's sound that stands out the most and is likely their unique selling point. And that, of course, is the lead vocalist, H.P. Baxter. So, like, you know when that Planet of the Bass song became a viral meme last year and it featured some parody rapper saying random sentences in broken English? Whoever made that almost certainly had H.P. Baxter specifically in mind when they came up with it. Imagine if Pitbull had a thick German accent and barely even tried to rhyme his lyrics or flow fast, and that's kinda what Baxter sounds like. He is an absolutely ridiculous presence, but that is clearly part of the appeal. I can't say I wasn't entertained by him occasionally rapping in German or yelling random shit like, "Waste your youth while we cause fire in the booth, yeah." Or, "I'm on a rush, who will be my crush?" And special shoutouts to the track For Those About to Rave when he introduces guest producer Timmy Trumpet. He says, "It's Timmy and Dave." Even though there's no one named Dave involved in any of this, he just needed something that rhymes with rave. He also goes, "Yeehaw!" like a cowboy, except I looked on the liner notes and Discogs and they spelled it Y-I-H-I-H. I love it, no notes. Not to say I like him all the time. No 60-year-old dude in the world should ever be telling people to open their trousers. But for the most part, I can't deny I found his presence endearing. Do I recommend this album? I don't know, the experience is pretty one note, and there's a lot of tracks, especially in the first half, which I found really annoying. Much like the Galantis album I covered earlier in this video, the chipmunk hooks were just too much for me to fully put up with, even if they're slightly less prevalent here than on that one. I'm very glad I didn't try to sit through 20 albums of this shit. That would have gotten old real fast, and I did not come out of this album hungering for any more than what I got. Still, I guess if you're just looking for Dance Dance Revolution nostalgia fodder or some ridiculous Eurodance meant to get a stadium of people going with one of the goofiest frontmen I've heard in a long time, then maybe give it a shot. It's not bad. I guess I can let it off with a 6.3 out of 10. Next up from Tycho, Infinite Health. It's another collection of okay background music, commercially polished vibes with post-rock guitars and stiff electropop drums. If you've heard a Tycho album before, then you've heard Infinite Health, and the time is long since past where they even had something resembling melodic hooks or dramatic weight, like on Awake, or semi-decent variety, like on Epoch. It's all just empty, substanceless vibes now. Nice and pleasant, but no real flavor to it or anything particularly notable at all. Check it out if you're feeling vanilla ice cream would be too spicy for you today. I'm overall feeling a solid 5 out of 10 on this. Next up from Kaytranada, Timeless. I don't have a good excuse for having missed the boat on Kaytranada twice. I knew his debut, 99.9%, had been making waves around the time that came out in 2016, and I just didn't get around to it back then. I pretty much agree with the hype for that project being really dang solid all around, with lots of mildly off-kilter feel-good vibes, mixing house and instrumental hip-hop in a particularly compelling way, like a less experimental Flying Lotus or Subtract. The instrumental cuts are the best moments, and especially the opener. And I also missed the boat on his sophomore album Bubba in 2019, even when that won the Grammy for Best Dance Electronic Album. Pretty much agree with the general consensus on that album too, in that it's not as good as the debut and falls in the background a lot more easily, but still mostly hits in the same way. But now we've got a third album from him, and I didn't want to make the same mistake a third time, even if the buzz I saw surrounding this latest one was even more lukewarm than ever before. And, well, yeah, I can see where that lukewarm buzz is coming from, but it's not that bad. I got a comparable level of enjoyment out of this as I did with Bubba. Guy's particular mix of summery, house-flavored hip-hop beats has gotten so safe and unchallenging that the Grammys were willing to let a gay black artist take home an award. Even an outfit like Disclosure has made more daring and experimental music than what this album has to offer. But you know, it's not bad for what it is. I'll take the solid grooves as they come. Heck, this album starts out really strong, and if I were just judging this based off of the promise of the first 4 or 5 tracks, I'd have said this was a return to the level of quality on his debut. The punchy horn samples on Opener Pressure, the liquid and sensual Spit It Out featuring possibly my favorite vocal performance on the album from Rochelle Jordan, the super satisfying banging pianos and disco string sections on Call You Up with Lou Phelps, and the especially funky Weird with Durand Bernard. No complaints from me on any of this stuff, just really messed with all of those, and they did almost get me properly excited for what I was getting into here. Just kind of a shame the rest of the album is hit and miss at best. There are still other standouts. Any of the tracks that have a smoother and lusher traditional instrumental hip-hop sound would connect with me more easily. Cuts like Still with Charlotte Day Wilson and Witchy with Childish Gambino sounded freaking fantastic. And to a lesser extent, Wasted Words with Thundercat. The sound on that one wasn't quite as impressive, but the quirky vibe of it was one of the more likable and flavorful ones here. I also like the trade-off between the break beats on Drip Sweat with Channel Trace going into the floatier synths and thumping dembo rhythms on Hold On with Dawn Richard. A really strong transition there, and both of those cuts can be marked as highlights. The rest of this thing, though, is just kind of okay and mostly bounces off of me without leaving an impression. Some tracks are carried entirely by the personality of their guest feature, but don't have anything else to... Thought I could get away with that one. Some tracks are carried entirely by the personality of their guest feature, but don't have anything else to offer outside of that, as seen with Anderson .Paak on Due to Me or Pink Pantheress on Snap My Finger. All the tracks without features, aside from the opener, and maybe Dance 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 Dance, were all totally bland and forgettable filler. Both discs on the album have an underwhelming ending, both with the odd Spice Girls interpolating lover/friend with Rochelle Jordan, and with the much more forgettable and arbitrary pick of a closer in Out of Luck with Marina the Scientist. And there were even a couple of cuts that started to dip into actively unpleasant territory for me. Feel Away with Don Tolliver had a much more sour-sounding instrumental, and the way his voice went over it made for an off-putting mix that just really immediately brought down the mood. And the worst track here for me has to be Video with Raven Lene. I really did not like the way her vocals were mixed to be super treble-heavy and emphasize her breathing way more than her actual singing, which itself is nothing to write home about. Not to mention the instrumental under her is one of the most sparse and empty on display. I guess at the end of the day, just as with his other albums, my thoughts appear to mostly line up with those of other people I've seen talking about it. If you were hoping for anything exciting or boundary-pushing, you're gonna have to look elsewhere. But I did at least feel like the high points here were higher than those on his last album. It's about an equal amount of quality, except Bubba spread it much more equally over all the tracks, where this one just stuffs it into a bunch of really good standouts. There's a potentially really strong 10-track half-hour mini-album here, but it's being buried under way too much bland filler, so take that as you will. Nothing essential, but it's decent. I'm feeling like a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Loidis, One Day. While we're on the topic of mid-tempo house grooves, albeit much more on the minimal tech house side, here's the latest project from Brian Leeds, better known as Orkun A, bringing back a random side alias under which he'd previously released one 3-track minimal house EP in 2018, but one day he just decided to make this full-length debut album for. According to the promo tweet announcing it, the title just comes from the fact that he recorded the entire thing in one day. I'd seen this getting a bit of buzz. I think Ski Mask was recommending it to people on Twitter too, so I threw it in here out of curiosity, and it's a tech house album, alright. Grooves are fine, dub techno synths are kind of cool, there's a nice bass line here and there, all kind of runs together. It does pick up a decent bit for me in the second half. My favorite track is Dollarama, which had a much more fluttery sound and some spacier ambience I thought was really nice. And I guess there's also the album's more lo-fi production style to note. This genre is typically known for much cleaner and more polished mixes, while this album sounds like a 360p YouTube rip. I've seen some people praise that approach specifically, and I'll admit the last two cuts did have a moody and muted sound where I felt like the mixing style was a benefit, though more often than not the blurriness just made it all the easier for me to check out. And that's about all I got. Album's fine, got its moments. You just want a collection of no-nonsense tech house without any twists, this'll do you fine. I kinda doubt people would care as much if it didn't come from an artist as well acclaimed as Orkun A, though. I'm overall feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on this. Next up from ROBY, Through the Mud. Don't mind, 'cause every time I apologize. Alright, next up we got this Boston-based artist currently affiliated with the Tabula Rasa Records label. I first found out about this guy through his appearance on Kelvin's EFYL album in 2021. The track they produced together, Explorer, was one of the best tracks on that album, and a cool mix of epic ambience and breakbeats. Though I hadn't heard anything else the guy put out, so when I saw this guy put out an album of his own, I wanted to give it a shot. And this was both kind of what I expected and also not at all what I expected. Instrumentally, it's got roughly the kind of sound I thought it might have. Not really breakbeat heavy, but it jumps around from trance to garage to synth pop to house to future bass to whatever. Most of the instrumentals are relatively stripped back, but they're always very bright and tuneful. So that part wasn't too far afield of what I expected, but what I didn't expect was the fact that ROBY sings himself on every track, and his vocals are much more of the primary focus. And he sounds kinda like Post Malone. He's got that same kind of like half-drowsy melancholy tone to his voice, and sometimes he even does that little vocal vibrato thing that Post Malone does too. That's not a complaint. He sounds pretty good, and I warmed up to his voice pretty quickly. Just not really what I expected, I guess. Really, the main reason to check this thing out is the hooks and melodies. This album at its core reads to me as more of a pop project than anything else, and despite the decently wide variety of instrumentals, all these tracks kind of go for the same idea and have the same appeal for me. But I did enjoy the whole thing in that vein. Highlights include the muted but colorful house beats on Mayday, the more emotional drum and bass mix on Tell Me a Story, the skittering breakbeats and garage patterns on the title track, the more chill approach to Fantasize, and the particularly bright and flashy closer Don't Mind with Juco, which might be the single most exciting banger on the album. Not really sure which one's my favorite, they're all pretty solid in their own ways. There are a couple of misses. Ironically, the track with Kelvin's co-production in Same Page didn't really hit for me. I mean, solid tune on that one, but got kinda undercut undercut by those chipmunk vocals. And Pick Up shows him totally changing up his vocal delivery and dipping way more into his falsetto in a way that wasn't that flattering. Kind of reminded me of Lil Yachty's Poland a little. But for the most part, I can't complain too much about what I got here. This stuff is really solid for what it's going for. You just want some modern-sounding indie pop tunes that get stuck in your head easily and sound nice. ROBY will have you covered. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. Next up from Lance Gurisik, Proffer. Alright, let's get back to some random Bandcamp diving, and boy was this a gem of a find, perfectly up my alley. This Australian artist got together an ensemble of various musicians to create a crossover between electronic, jazz, and orchestral music, with noted influences as vast as Manuel Gosching, Terry Riley, and the band Air. And it sounds freaking amazing. Brisk and energetic live drumming, 70 synth progressions, and the Air influence really coming in through the way the orchestras are utilized. The strings all over this album absolutely freaking cement this album within great territory on their own. Not to say it's perfect by any stretch, the album as a complete whole is structured and paced a bit awkwardly, and the more energetic moments were often way more impactful than the quieter ones. There's cuts like Dissonance, the opener Stasis, and the penultimate cut Changes, which do offer a lot of really nice dramatic string pads that I liked a lot on their own, but in context can sometimes feel like a bit of an unnatural drop in energy. And the closer and title track made for a very strange finish that started out almost completely silent, built up over time with all the instruments forming an odd, formless experimental cloud, and just as it sounded like everything was about to take form and hit a big satisfying climax point, the album just stops dead in an out-of-nowhere hard cut. Not super crazy about that, but the shit that's good on this album is really, really damn good. Tracks like Prednisone and Nepzine bring in all these bright synth progressions and breezy, hard-hitting live drums to go up next to their mysteriously sour but intriguing string sections, which sound like they're taking some mild Middle Eastern influence in their melodies. A track like Welter makes for a big emotional center in the way its most Air-like strings go up against warm synths and almost disco-ish drumming. Glut is a welcome change of pace that brings in all these bright bells and xylophones to go up against the minimal synth arpeggios and one of the most colorful mixes on display. And speaking of minimalism, the one quieter track here I really liked was the 8-minute sort of centerpiece Balance that leans the most heavily into the old school synths and where I can most easily hear the influence from something like Terry Riley's A Rainbow in Curved Air. Except of course with more strings and more emotional and cinematic chord progressions. I may have my issues with this thing, but man, the stuff that impressed me on here really impressed me. I'd definitely recommend giving this a shot. Maybe this could possibly notch here in a list spot too, and we'll see how that goes, but in the meantime, yeah, I think I can say this is great. I'll let it off with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Throwing Snow, Isthmus. Throwing Snow is the alias for the currently Ireland-based producer Ross Tones, and while this was one of the picks I found while randomly Bandcamp diving and just picked it up when it was marked as new and notable and I thought the album cover looked cool, after looking into the guy more, I feel like this is the kind of artist where I have no idea how I wasn't made aware of him long before now. He's been at it since the late 2000s, regularly putting out well-acclaimed albums since 2014 on the Houndstooth label, who are a sub-label of Fabric Records. This album included Bonobo and Fortet in the Bandcamp tags, not because his style sounds anything remotely like them, but because he's got connections to them. Bonobo included him in his Fabric DJ mix. I don't know what his Fortet connection is, but that guy follows him on Twitter. I'm assuming there's also some DJ connection there. He's also done remixes for the likes of Hybrid, Max Cooper, Sasha, and Gold Panda, among loads of others in the past. And other people that I saw following him on Twitter include Mike Paradinas, Graham Massey, Fela, Plaid, and Flying Lotus. But all of that isn't even getting into his actual music, which is very difficult to quickly sum up. Like, there is a common denominator of a certain mildly harsh and gritty electro-tinged, slightly rival consoles-esque synth palette that he tends to use, but his actual arrangements can dip into anything from garage to dubstep to house to techno to drum and bass to breakbeat to IDM to indie pop to jazz to even world and folk music. Anything goes with this guy, and you really can't predict what might be coming next. In fact, I was also intrigued enough by what I heard from him to catch myself up on his previous 4 studio albums, so here's my quick thoughts on those. His debut album shows him both at his poppiest and most organic sounding, including lots of different world music instrumentation and mostly unknown female vocal guests such as Kid A or Ada Calais, who feel like sufficient stand-ins for Björk and Lana Del Rey, respectively. It's the closest any of his albums come to a bonobo comparison being apt, though it's still way rougher and harder hitting than any of that guy's work. Maybe like a more dubstep-influenced Forced Swords or something, although with way more stylistic variety than anything that guy's done. It's really good, maybe even a possible keeper. This album shows him focusing entirely on the synth-heavy aspect to his sound with not nearly as much live instrumentation and no vocal guests, but still builds one heck of an expansive and well-varied trip with 14 tracks perfectly linking together in a continuous mix. I feel like this was where he really nailed his unique sonic identity down. I was feeling the length a bit, but I was impressed as hell by what I heard anyway. I think I can call this properly great. A collection of tracks originally released on a series of loose EPs and kind of focusing on the same variety of sounds from Embers with more low-key garage beats and stuff, I guess. It's pretty good, but didn't impress me on the level of the first two. More of the same kind of stuff as seen on his last album, but with more organic textures like strings and stuff and even darker and more foreboding on average. It's in all the same ways as his other albums, but kind of went in one ear and out the other. Which brings us to here. So yeah, this guy's definitely put out some quality work in the past. Those first two albums in particular I can probably hang on to. But it was hearing this newest album, Isthmus, which first convinced me to go back and hear all those old ones, since this album is also properly great and up there with his best. Hearing this for the first time reminded me a lot of the first time I heard the album Blizzards by Nathan Fake in 2020. Just hearing this guy take all these rough and lo-fi sounding analog synths and make all sorts of different spins on dance music formulas in such a way that had me like, man, synths are really freaking cool, aren't they? This album kind of does something similar in the way it's all about molding synths into lots of cool different shapes, but given how much more eclectic Throwing Snow's style has been, the results are much more unpredictable and stylistically all over the place in the best way. And on first listen, I was legit caught off guard by just how many different directions this album ended up going in. You got a rough and abrasive electro banger like Apricity going directly into two experimental tracks with obvious Indian and Middle Eastern influence, like the clattering 6/8 bounce of The Madness of the Bull, featuring plenty of sitar and rapid synth guitar plucks and hand percussion, or Rasp, which has both a classic dubstep breakdown and a breakbeat breakdown and adds some droning Middle Eastern instrumentation on top of them. And then that suddenly transitions over into the standard organic house of Whispers with lots of blaring semi-distorted electro leads, which are paradoxically kind of both chill and intense at the same time. And then Ephemeral is the most quartet-ish thing that Throwing Snow has ever done, featuring all these glittering chimes and various chopped up and processed vocal samples going over some thick burial-esque garage beats. In the second half of the album, we get all the project's loudest moments. There's a 3-track run featuring all this album's most visceral bangers, such as Chimera, which has this super dense mix of bright and energetic live drumming and percussion and squonking experimental bell leads that sort of give me mild Hudson Mohawk vibes. Hear the Tongue Fork is the album's most rival Consoles-ish moment, but still goes about that rough analog synth palette with more force and intensity than the vast majority of that guy's catalog. And An Arrow to Follow has this big build-up with all these nice and pleasant flute arpeggios, paying off into this crazy UK garage drop with these loud foghorn-esque blasts of bass. But all these loudest moments get immediately followed by the album's quietest moments, including the abrasively humming synth ambience of Riven, the much more peaceful ambience of Mourn, which features lots of Middle Eastern-style violin soloing on top, and finally closing with Tides that just spits warm and pleasant high-volume analog synth melodies at you before building up to such an intensity that it almost borders on becoming a noise piece, but sidechained with a really subtle techno kick. This album is freaking nuts. I just never knew what it was going to do next at any given point. Not to say I don't have my minor issues, be it a couple of interludes like the mildly unpleasant Asunder or the intro Ribboning that add more abrasive synth melodies but don't really stand out or add much of particular substance. Or just the fact that I wouldn't be surprised if the constantly abrasive and blown out approach to this album's production ends up wearing out on me if I were to put it on frequently enough. It did already start to slightly shrink on me over the 3 listens I gave it while writing this segment, but I think the sheer creativity on display here is more than enough to make up for that. Consider me officially converted into a Throwing Snow fan at this point. Even if this won't be my absolute favorite of the year, I think it has a pretty safe lock for the year-end list somewhere. I'm feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Nathan Haines. Notes. Alright, next I figured I needed a palate cleanser after all that rough electro stuff, so the next random Bandcamp find is an acid jazz and house crossover from this New Zealand saxophonist. He's apparently been putting out records as far back as the 90s, but this is the only thing I've heard from him. And honestly, it was exactly what I needed. Just lots of really freaking nice and cleanly produced jazzy house mixes with just the right level of chill and danceability that I might hope for out of like a typical Larry Heard project or something. I will say a few of the vocalists can occasionally be a little bit on the cheesy and plastic side, like with La Coco's appearance on the reggaeton-infused Come Into the Light, or Rachel Clark's vocals on the otherwise super smooth bossa nova of Storm. Also, I think Haines himself tried to take lead vocals on the title track and it did not go over well. But for the most part, this was really freaking nice. Lots of really solid deep house jams with lots of lush jazzy flares seen on tracks like Love You More and my personal favorite cut here, Journey to the Peak. A lot of Underground Resistance, Galaxy to Galaxy vibes coming off of that one. And tracks such as that one and the more down-tempo instrumental Belo Dia are particularly neat for bringing in some nice, not really orchestral strings to add some warmth and texture to their mixes. There's tracks which really nail down danceable and organic banging grooves like on Sleek, and the bonus track closer Get Up to Get Down, which frankly I have no idea why that's marked as a bonus track at all. That one probably bangs harder than anything else here. And there are more vocal cuts that go over well than don't. Brother of Mine with Vanessa Freeman and Give Thanks with Arjuna Oakes and Mark de Clive Lowe have strong, soulful tunes. I did like the tracks with the rapper EO, as seen on the more lo-fi hip-hop of Just Holding On and the more new disco-y Don't Think. And the best vocal cut was probably Night Moves with ROBY right at the beginning, just really groovy stuff there. The whole album, even in its worst moments, is a vibe, and I mess with the whole thing. This very much scratches a particular itch for well-textured jazzy deep house that I haven't gotten this well executed since, like, 10 Cities Judgment album back in 2021. Even if that album's still probably better than this. There were enough really nice vibes where I could even theoretically see myself keeping this around. If that sounds like your thing, then check it out. I had a lot of fun with it. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Blueshades, meet the Leafmask. Alright, Blueshades. This is my second time covering this small-time Florida-based IDM artist. Back in the Volume 8 roundup, I covered his album In Spite of Myself, and I thought it was quite solid. A very cozy and heartfelt IDM blend that combined lots of thick and glitchy mixes with acoustic instrumentation like strings and indie pop influences. It was really nice, hit a solid emotional note, worth going back to if you haven't heard it before. When I saw he'd come out with a follow-up project, I was definitely intrigued to find out what that might be like, and it was definitely pretty interesting. Bit of a change of pace, actually. This album both sees a bit of a shift in sound, leaning much further into the psychedelic indie pop influences and away from the IDM influences. There's still enough IDM in the mix to still qualify as electronic, but the primary influence isn't so much on the side of Metamatics and Ochre as it is the Beatles and Tame Impala, especially the Beatles. The opener even has an interpolation of Dear Prudence. And it comes with a jump in production quality to match. In comparison to his last album, which had much more of a lo-fi DIY sound to it, the mixes on this one are way more spacious and reverby. There's acoustic drumming, flutes, mellotrons, live bass lines. It's really well polished. Heck, the Beatles-y psychedelic pop rock tunes were actually a fair bit more enjoyable for me than the more IDM and electronic cuts, since not only were they clearly the main focus, that particular late 60s sound is really well recaptured through these mixes, and they all have solidly catchy hooks to back them up. My favorites include Eyes Watchers, Over Again and Then Again, and Through Your Eyes. All three of those are legit excellent. Ironically, the more electronic-centric stuff tended not to stand out as much to me by comparison. A lot of those cuts mostly came in the way of like semi-experimental ambient interludes like Innards or Incandescent or the title track, which are still nice and add some welcome variety, but they're clearly not the main event. And the one standard-length wholly electronic cut, Words Are Like Sand, was actually probably the weakest track for me. The way all those synth cascades swallow up the vocals and make them sound kind of odd and off-kilter didn't really come together quite as effectively as maybe some of these other cuts. I think I'm inclined to say that this is an improvement on In Spite of Myself with its markedly better production and better hooks. Although even if this is closer to breaking the properly great threshold, I'd hesitate to say it quite gets there. The vocals are still kinda weak and occasionally a little off-key in certain moments, and the album also strikes me as being really short. It's only about a half hour and I was left hungering for more. Could have easily been game for another couple of tracks to bring things up to 40 minutes, but still, this is another really solid effort from Blueshades that's just as worth checking out as his last one. I enjoyed this a lot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from ZULI, Lambda. Okay, next random Bandcamp find comes from this Egyptian producer. Never heard of him before picking this album up from my Bandcamp Daily feature and haven't heard anything else he's done. Anyway, this is a very strange experimental ambient record that hits you with lots of intense walls of monolithic pads and various odd noises, including several vocalists who give mostly freeform performances. The closest sonic parallel I can make is maybe Zen-era Arca without any of the beats. It can be a pretty harrowing and off-putting listen. There are lots of tracks that can get a bit much for me. Sometimes thanks to the vocalists not being my thing, like Michael Braley on Sizji and 10,000 Paper Cuts, or the incomprehensible spoken word on the track Facile Quisir, falling into a structureless void. And some tracks start to dip a little into noise territory as seen on The Horn, or especially Myth. The latter is chopping up its paths like a constantly stuttering radio broadcast with lots of rapid-fire frame-long noises and silences. And it sounds like the equivalent of my ears being forcibly scraped against concrete. Really did not care for that one at all. But there's just as many cuts that do sound really cool. Probably won't surprise people to hear that the album's more peaceful and melodic moments tended to click with me more, like the processed vocal chops going over expansive ambience on cuts like Trachea and Be It. The track Plateau uses some tremolo-heavy guitars and a cool understated vocal performance from Abdullah Minyawi in the background and added up to some neat effect. There's a track called Ast that features a traditional rap verse from Kobe Say, which was pretty cool, and easily the best moment for me was the opener and the way all the cascading crystalline ambience went up against these formless drum and bass influenced mixes of processed percussion. I suspect this is very much the kind of album that is going to be hitting a lot more with certain specific audiences who have more of a stomach for this particular brand of abrasive experimentalism than I am. It's very much the kind of thing that I ended up respecting more than I ended up actively enjoying, but I did still enjoy it anyway, and I found the core emotions behind it to come across effectively as well, so take that as you will. It's a cool album. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from DJ Sabrina The Teenage DJ, Hex. Okay, new DJ Sabrina project, and only a 2-hour album this time. That's pretty tight and breezy by Sabrina standards. Now, if you're looking for literally anything that you haven't already heard out of loads of DJ Sabrina projects in the past, you're going to be disappointed. Nothing here substantially diverges from the standard formula of emotional Disney Channel vibes and dense house bangers you would expect. And this is absolutely not the kind of project that's going to be converting anyone into DJ Sabrina fans who weren't fans already. But hey, if you were already a fan and are game for more of the same, this'll still be a pretty fun listen for what it is. And while there is a pretty long stretch in the middle which just kinda runs together for me and doesn't deliver much of interest outside of the standard Sabrina fare, there are plenty of highlights to mention, especially at the beginning and end of the album. I did perk up when literally the second track on the album, This Station, was a change of pace and a propulsive drum and bass featuring all these kinda dubby shouted vocal snippets and even flutes. Don't think I've ever heard a Sabrina track that sounds like that before. And the faster beat work of Come Find Out, followed by the epic buildup of Deep Down, starting out more understated and ascending to dramatic heights over the course of nearly 13 minutes, were really exciting as well. The album also ends really strongly with a whole run of the last 5 tracks. Carnival features all these punchy horn sections and string punctuations and might be the most colorful and well-textured cut on the album. There was a 3-minute interlude called The Hextony, which featured nothing but a banging hip-hop breakbeat and lots of squirting synth effects without any melody, which was pretty refreshing. The marching percussion-heavy mixes in the beginning of the title track were pretty interesting. The functional closer, Hold On, is another 12.5-minute arrangement that has a lot of cool progressions and hits some of the stronger emotional notes. And it ends in 2.5 minutes of a string quartet for the outro cut, 10, which was really nice. And in the middle of the album, I guess I can also go to bat for Couldn't Say That having a strong hook, and In Silence breaking up the sound of the project with a more understated piano-driven 90s R&B mix. But that's about all I got. The rest was fun and kept up the good vibes, but also fell in the background for me. Overall, it's a DJ Sabrina album. At this point, you should already know what to expect and have a good idea on whether or not this will be your thing. I'm not going to say this comes anywhere near being as impressive or engaging as Destiny was for me last year, but it was a fun enough time and there were enough highlights to say it was worth the time I set aside for it. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Kiasmos, 2. Kiasmos is the Icelandic-based duo of classical composer and producer Olafur Arnalds and electronic producer Janus Rasmussen. Back in 2014, they released a self-titled album together on Erased Tapes Records, and having gone back and heard that myself, I can confirm that project was really freaking nice. A collection of stripped-back minimal techno and garage beats combined with delicate piano and orchestral arrangements that pretty much typifies the kind of sound you'd expect out of the Erased Tapes label. The whole thing even kind of blended together into an effective continuous mix and felt like it had a very loose narrative arc to it. While the duo has released a handful of EPs in the interim, they finally came back this year with this album as a full-length sequel to their debut 10 years after the fact, pretty much just exploring the exact same blend of sounds as before. And well, it does hit in the same way as their self-titled record does, with the nice and chill minimal techno grooves with plenty of emotional pianos and strings. Though I don't think this is as strong an effort as the self-titled, for the simple reason that I legit can't meaningfully tell any of the 11 tracks apart from each other. The mix of musical elements is the exact same across all tracks. Garage beats, light synths and bass lines, pianos, maybe some strings. All of it feels very light and breezy, but adds up to a particularly melancholic and sad atmosphere. All these mixes are extraordinarily pretty, and the melodies are always well constructed to hit that specific tone they're going for, but there's basically no variety from track to track, aside from maybe which instruments get more focused than others. And even then, it's not really that noticeable. I want to say, like, a couple like Burst, Bound, and Squared had more obvious usages of strings, Sailed and Spun had some brighter and more lighthearted synths, Sworn had some more pianos and some kind of like tapping on glass percussion. I don't know, I'm really scraping for things to say and I'm drawing a near complete blank here. I still enjoyed the record. At the very least, the formula being repeated over and over here is an effective one that never actively grew stale for me over the course of the album's length. There was enough emotional resonance here to still call the album good, even if only just. So I guess take that all as you will. I'm feeling a solid 7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Pete Sasqwax Beat Cult, Initiation Ritual. Next random Bandcamp find comes from this instrumental hip-hop producer from Sheffield. And if you told me I was going to be listening to some Sheffield-based instrumental hip-hop, I think this is about what I would expect to hear. This is an album full of viscerally banging breaks and dark, gritty experimentalism on top, evoking the mildly depressing vibes of that particular city. Anything ranging from foreboding synth blends to dark ambience to psychedelic wailing guitar samples. If you've heard the darkest and grittiest parts of DJ Shadow's introducing, such as Napalm Brain, Scatterbrain, or maybe a little bit of his later track Give Me Back the Nights, albeit without any of the sampled screaming and ranting, a lot of this stuff sounds kinda like that. And it was a very cool vibe that I enjoyed immersing myself in, mostly just really got into it for how satisfying the drums were. There isn't necessarily much to break down or analyze. It's split into 19 distinct parts, but they all intentionally try to go for the same sort of musty vibe that brings to mind imagery of brick buildings and fog. The album functionally operates as a single 45-minute track with lots of change-ups. Still, I guess I can mention some highlights like how parts 1 and 4 had some of the most satisfying breaks, or how part 2 and the second half of part 6 are just experimental dark ambient workouts, or how part 9 sounds more lo-fi and slightly bit-crushed, or how part 14 and 17 feature some really epic and propulsive synth builds that remind me of the best parts of what Shadow did recently on his action-adventure album, or how part 11 has some neat DJ scratching, or part 8 has some pitched-down narration that I didn't love. I don't know. At the end of the day, while this isn't going to be setting the world on fire and I don't know if it's the kind of thing I'm going to keep around longer term, there weren't any projects I found in the past couple of months that sounded quite like it, and all of this is very well executed for what it's going for, so yeah, I think I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Xylitol, Anemones. And if you want something to comparatively lighten the mood, here's a British DJ and producer, real name Catherine Backhouse, also known as DJ Bunnyhausen, releasing this album on Planet Mu, focused mostly on a lot of jungle breakbeats and light and pleasant melodies that are apparently take influence from Slavic pop music. I wouldn't be able to identify the difference the latter influence makes, but it is apparently an inspiration regardless. This is going to be a basic as hell parallel to make, but if you're a fan of stuff like Aphex Twin's Flim, or maybe Music's recent work such as Magic Pony Ride and Grush, you'll probably mess with this thing. Highlights include propulsive bangers like Jelena and Iskria, tracks like Oko and Miha that feature all these cheery whistling synth tones adding up to a more spacious vibe, a track like Monte Mare that has more of a chill Boards of Canada-y feel to it, or of course the 9-minute centerpiece Mobius that is just as hard-hitting and spacey and epic as you'd probably expect it to be. I don't really have much else to analyze about it beyond that. It's just some nice, melodically wistful jungle breakbeat material. It doesn't necessarily stand out from the crowd much in the context of this genre, but I don't have much to complain about it either. I enjoyed it all the way through, and the experience never ran together or stretched on too long either. Stopped at a tight 44 minutes. I don't think this is going to change anyone's life, but it's a fun time. If that sounds like your thing, then check it out. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. Next up from Zedd, Talos. Wow, Zedd. Now there's a name I haven't thought about in a very long time. Look, it's probably a stretch to say I hadn't thought about him at all in a long time. The guy's debut album from 2012, Clarity, I think can fairly easily be argued to be a proper classic at this point. Certainly one of the absolute best albums to come out of the entire mainstream EDM scene of the 2010s. Possibly even the best to come out of that crowd of big-name EDM producers that got mainstream radio play at the time. Even if that's not necessarily a high bar. While much of the rest of that particular scene feels more and more dated and poorly aged as the years have gone by, Clarity still totally holds up and has even gotten better and better for me over the years. Both a perfect snapshot of that moment in time while never feeling shallow, just wall-to-wall great songs both on the radio pop side and the aggressive electro house side, and being super tight and to the point without any room for error. Mind you, nothing Zedd ever came up with after that album has even really come in the same ballpark of quality as that album. His second album, True Colors, in 2015 was generally pretty good and had its moments, but wasn't nearly as tight or consistent, and the opener, Addicted to a Memory, pretty handily outclasses any of the other tracks there. And after that album, he focused way more on trying to play for mainstream radio play, with very popular hits like Stay in the Middle and Starving, some of which were fine at the time, but all pretty mediocre at best in retrospect. Also working behind the scenes with big-name pop artists like Katy Perry past her prime. And at some points, his music just stopped being interesting for me and I stopped paying attention to what he was doing. I hadn't been looking out for any new music for him since the days when he could still chart on Billboard semi-regularly as the lead artist and not just as a producer behind the scenes. Still, as long as it had been since I cared enough to pay attention to Zedd, the announcement of a long-awaited third studio album was enough to turn my head and get me mildly interested. I had no idea what a new album from him would be like in 2024, so far out of mainstream EDM's prime. I figured it'd be chasing modern house trends and making more shallow attempts for airplay crossover, so I kinda went in with pretty low expectations. And I'll say this, while Talos is no masterpiece, I'll admit I was pleasantly surprised by the whole thing. With maybe a few exceptions, this feels much more like Zedd was making music to please himself and fulfill his own passions, rather than try for more bland radio filler. I might even say it's roughly on par with True Colors. It is, however, less consistent than that album. There are more high points than that one, but the low points are much lower. In one breath, there's a lot of tracks that feel like they're trying out a bunch more complex chord progressions and mildly classical-inspired cadences. The first two tracks, Out of Time and Tangerine Rays, made for a really strong start to this thing. And tracks like Dream Brother and Decensus also felt particularly well-textured and musically complex by the standards of this genre. A lot of really interesting and well-investing stuff that hits on a particular note that I've never heard out of Zedd before. There's even a couple of tracks that try to bring in some more varied world music influences, like the percussive Indian-inspired Shanti, or the track Sona, which brings in a traditional Celtic folk band to accompany him. The former of those two did maybe get a little cheesy in some spots, but it was still pretty cool. On the other hand, there are some real clunkers here as well. I already had rock-bottom expectations for the track Automatic Yes featuring John Mayer, for reasons I think are fairly self-explanatory. I am not interested in hearing a comeback for the Your Body is a Wonderland guy, and especially not on a song with a title like that. But while that track was in fact not good, it turned out to just be kind of fillerish and forgettable more than anything, instead of anything actively cringeworthy. No, the worst moment was probably Lucky featuring Remy Wolf. The chorus of that one sounds really herky-jerky and awkward, and the way her voice is stuttered feels really dated and ugly. That one kinda sucks. And I also didn't care much for the Muse collab at the very end either, even if I get the appeal. It's going out of its way to be hyper-melodramatic, and Matt Bellamy keeps referencing Ave Maria. It gets to be a bit much, to say the least. The whole string quartet section at the end is kinda nice, though. Oh yeah, and No Gravity is a track that exists too. It's fine. But, I mean, I will have to give Zedd credit. I went into this album expecting the whole album to be like No Gravity or Lucky, and it was much better than I thought it would be. It does feel like he was actively trying on this album both to push himself and try new things, as well as hunker down on the core of what actually made his old music work so well. The continuous mix and segues between tracks are really well executed too, not unlike the continuous mix on Clarity. This is an album that reconfirms many of my old frustrations with Zedd, but it does also remind me of how he did used to really stick out from the scene as something special back in the old days. It's not going to change your life or sit among my favorites of the year or anything. There's too many mediocre or even bad tracks for me to say it's that good, but it is good. Good enough to even actually be worth giving a shot. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Knickknack, Irati. Okay, now this was an interesting find. This is a producer and DJ from Leeds, real name Nicole Raymond, creating an experimental concept album combining elements of IDM, ambient, jazz, drum and bass, and more, inspired by themes of Afrofuturism and imagery from the movie Blade Runner. Sounded directly up my alley, and I made sure to pick it up once I randomly came across it in a Bandcamp Daily feature, and yeah, it's really dang cool. Tons of variety through this thing too, like, just look at the sharp contrast made between the first two tracks. You got This Pile of Rubble is More Human as the opener, hitting you with lots of formless experimental bleeps and bloops, zooming out into a chaotic ambient noise piece that slowly gets more expansive sounding and also a little more relaxed as it goes along. Super out there stuff, but then it's immediately followed by You Were Never Supposed to Be Good, which is like a super smooth and accessible drum and bass banger with lots of really smooth and jazzy instrumentation and sax solos and stuff. They do feel thematically connected in forming that futuristic city atmosphere, but going about that goal from such diametrically opposed approaches. All the other tracks fall somewhere between those two extremes. There's more drum and bass cuts like 12,000 RPM, which has a lot less melody but goes really hard, or Pandora's Box, which features some more expansive ambience with some smooth vocals care of Agama, or the brighter trance synth arpeggios on Loadout, or Break My Bones, which feels like a deconstruction of a drum and bass banger that has a lot of the same ingredients but is rebuilding them from the ground up into completely unfamiliar abstract shapes. Meanwhile, there's also a lot more experimental and ambient cuts as well, tracks that just throw lots more abstract mechanical noise at you, like Burning Bright, or get more spacious and relaxed, like More Life, or Within Cells, which has all these insane processed string manipulations. And of course, we can't forget the closer, You've Never Seen a Miracle, feeling like the natural culmination of everything on the album. Smooth filtered vocal performances from Chisara Agor, going over dense rain sound effects, building into a kinda off-kilter, dubby, and almost vaporwavy mix that brings back the saxophones near the end. Now, all of this sounds great. And I do love all the creativity in display and how they do all find completely different ways to evoke that Afrofuturist Blade Runner theme. This thing is very close to being properly great. However, I do think it comes up just a bit shy, mainly because there is one single obvious clunker in the track listing, being mere data. This is another experimental noise piece with lots of formless machine sounds and bleeping and blooping, kind of like how the opener started. And there's also spoken word from slow-pitched sound, kind of discussing some introspective themes and kind of being glitched up and being kind of hard to make out everything being said. On paper, I think this could be cool, and the content of the spoken word I can make out is cool enough too, but this track feels like it's dragging on for ages. It doesn't meaningfully progress over time, and despite only being 4.5 minutes, it just absolutely tanks the album's pacing. This should have been a quick interlude at best, and honestly I think it might be better off skipped over altogether, given there's other tracks that offer similar enough ideas without the spoken word or slowdown in pacing. For instance, you probably don't need both this track and Burning Bright so close to each other. That does start to get a bit like overkill. And while I'm at it, unrelated to that, there is a part of me who kind of wishes this album had been like a continuous mix or something, since a lot of the tracks here feel pretty disconnected from each other. Directly segueing them together somehow would have been a great way to even further set up a sense of overarching atmosphere and make them feel like they belong together more. But it also clearly wasn't designed with that in mind. This point isn't really a criticism so much as it is a passive wish that would have been cool. Anyway, even with all my issues, this is a very cool album. I can definitely recommend it to people if all this sounds like your thing. I might even end up hanging on to it, we'll see. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Seefeel, Everything's Squared. Damn, Seefeel! Talk about one of the last names I was expecting to hear come up again this year. For the record, I have already covered this band once in the past. Just last year I covered their debut album Keek for a Patreon request, and I did briefly go over their history and my thoughts on their other stuff. But if you don't know about them, they are low-key one of the most influential and frequently overlooked bands of the 90s. They were right there at the beginning of the IDM scene in the days when Aphex Twin and Antypica were getting their start and got signed to Warp Records alongside them, though they were also much more unique in the way they combined that classic early 90s IDM sound with shoegaze and dub. They were kind of a rock band who primarily made electronic music. You'll commonly see them as like one of your favorite band's favorite bands. They were a big inspiration on many an act in both the rock and electronic worlds. However, they aren't talked about too often, presumably at least partially since they release music so incredibly infrequently. They had 2.5 albums in the 90s, they had a comeback record in 2011, and that was literally all their albums until they've finally just come back now with another mini album in 2024, 13 years after their last release. And what might be even more surprising is that this is easily the most I've enjoyed a Seefeel project since their debut in 1993. I do feel like Seefeel's albums after their debut tended not to be as special for me since they focused either just on the ambient techno or just on the shoegaze and dream pop without trying to blend them together like they started out doing, and in the process lost a lot of what really made them unique. This project, meanwhile, despite being, darker than the debut, I feel like does a much more effective job to focusing on the kinds of sounds that you can only get from them and them alone. Heck, for the first 4 tracks of this thing, I was starting to wonder if I thought this was properly great. It was really something to hear Sarah Peacock's voice again being processed and warped over the skeletal beats and classic 90s synth pads and guitar distortion effects. That is the classic Seefeel sound in a nutshell, perfectly recreated. And then the jangly melodic samples on Multifolds, the pensive, fluty synth melodies on Lose the Minus, and the thunderous and janky experimental beat work on Anti-Skeptic going up against more odd and mysterious melodic textures. I was really messing with all of that. I feel like Anti-Skeptic in particular was kinda deconstructing their sound in a new way that they hadn't done before, but was still easily recognizable as their style. I do think they kinda lost me a bit with the last 2 tracks. Hooked Paw suddenly took a turn for the much more unpleasant as Sarah Peacock's voice started to have a lot less of a tune and make some really sour clashing harmonies over the minimal dubby percussion. Was not crazy about that one. And the ending, End of Here, felt a little anticlimax too, with some much simpler arrangements of synth pads going over more minimal percussion. That was just alright. But I could even imagine those cuts really working for other people too. Maybe the fans who love Sakura will really mess with those more. Either way, this was a surprisingly strong showing. I felt like they finally successfully recaptured the entire core appeal they had in the early 90s instead of only recapturing one specific part of it. I'm obviously not going to say this is better than their debut. I think that one's classic status looms too large over this. Not to mention that's obviously a full album, this is more like 2/3 of one. But yeah, this was really freaking good. I can definitely recommend checking it out. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Isthmus, Intertransit. Well, in the last roundup I covered 2 back-to-back albums by Isthmus, so what's one more? For reference, earlier this year, this New York house and techno producer put out an album in February called Save the World that was full of propulsive bangers that mostly ran together for me but kept up the feel-good vibes pretty effectively, followed by a second album in March called Moblu, which saw him totally switching over into a more of a darker ambient style and combining that with his techno and house sounds to much more varied, albeit less consistent results. Both albums were an hour and a half, and there probably could have been a really good hour-long album taken out of just the best moments from both, but I suppose the contrast between the two projects was an interesting idea. And now we got a third one to add on to those from this August, thankfully only an hour this time. And what's also neat is that there's no overlap in sound between this album and his other 2 this year. This one's all classic epic drum and bass bangers, a la A Guy Called Gerald's Black Secret Technology minus the jazz or dub influences. I also think it got much closer to hitting that happy medium of not feeling incohesive or all over the place, but also not running together too much and having at least some variety. Particular highlights of note include the bright bleepy melodies on tracks like Definition and New Love, the thicker bass lines on DNA, the much spacier and more chill, expansive melodic sound of Fantasy Star, the almost kinda vaporwavy sample chops on Passion, and of course the harder hitting breaks on Inscription of Breaks. Not to say this thing is incredible or anything, there is still some clear filler here. You'll run into a weaker or less engaging cut every now and then, such as Space-Time Continuum or Existential Life. But this is definitely the easiest and best constructed overall listen of the 3 albums that Isthmus has released this year. Maybe we could be at the point where there's a potentially properly great album to be gleaned out of the best material from all 3 projects. I'll leave that up to your discretion though. In the meantime, this is a good album. I can give it my thumbs up. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Park, Stonelands. Alright, next up we got the latest project to be promoted by the Upscale label. Hudson Lee is actually the mastering engineer on this project. It's not a neuro-IDM project or anything like that, though. It's much more of an airy and atmospheric melodic house record in the same vein as artists like Leaving Laurel or Tourist. And probably slightly better than the actual Tourist album released earlier this year. Not as good as the Tourist album from 2022, but it is really dang good. If you just want a lot of big and expansive, well-textured ambience with lots of breezy dance beats and warm and heartfelt but melancholic emotional melodies, this is gonna be the album for you. Pretty solid variety of styles too. Got some garage-based stuff like Dionysian and Lighthouse. The latter starts to wear the burial influence on its sleeve pretty obviously with that mildly off-kilter organic beat pattern. Got some other dubstep influence sounds like on Modern Euphoric. The opener, As If You Understand What's Going On, has a bit of an indie pop flavor to it that gives me mild Porter Robinson vibes. There's 2 full-on ambient tracks given fittingly mirrored titles in You'll Know When You Feel It and When You Feel It, You'll Know. There's a couple of tracks that get a bit more creative and interesting with their sound design, like how Night Painting has a cool use of a soul sample before bringing in all this clattering African-sounding hand percussion and wailing strings in the background. Or Hanging Garden, which goes for more of a drum and bass flavor and has all these cascading pianos, hyperspeed kalimba textures, and some of those stock Lion King Eastern flute samples utilized in a cool way too, before culminating in an out-of-nowhere violin cover of Amazing Grace. Really dang cool stuff. I think that one's my second favorite cut here, but the best track here has to be Sun Mirrors. That track feels like an emotional centerpiece of sorts, with some of the most densely well-layered synth pads and guitars and choirs going up next to this clanking metallic vocal chop. And what really makes that track in particular go the extra mile is that whole section at the end where all the instrumental elements go away and there's a switch up into a whole vocoder a cappella section a la Imogen Heap's Hide and Seek. That part really got to me, I'm not gonna lie. Heck, that track was enough of a heavy hitter that it seems he decided to basically repeat it minus the vocoder part at the end for the album's 8-minute centerpiece Comforter, although I didn't find the idea as evocative there. But yeah, overall really nice and uplifting stuff all around on this album. Don't love every track on this thing as much as the next, but it is all very cohesively structured, and all these tracks do well to feel like they belong together and create the same overarching sense of place, while also finding plenty of different ideas to iterate on the core airy sound of the whole record. We'll see how much this holds up for me longer term, but in the meantime, I can definitely recommend giving this a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. And finally, from Casino vs. Japan, Tagebuch einer Verlorenen. Right, and to close things off, here's a new one from Casino vs. Japan, the well-acclaimed cult favorite Wisconsin-based IDM producer known for his combinations of standard IDM blends of crunchy percussion and Boards of Canada-style melodic sketches with mild rock, dream pop, and shoegaze influences. Last year I did a video on this guy's album Hitori plus Kaizo 1998 to 2001 for a Patreon request and really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. Though I hadn't bothered to go back and hear anything else he released outside of that album. When I saw the release of a surprise new project from him here, his first proper album in 6 years, I thought, hey, this is going to give me a good opportunity to go back and hear the rest of his catalog. I'm interested in seeing what I'm missing there, especially since I saw a lot of enthusiasm and urging from his fans to do so when I initially posted my Hitori plus Kaizo video. So I went back and caught myself up, and here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. So, first off, his self-titled debut compiles together a whole bunch of disparate experimental sketches through thematically linked mini-suites, ranging anywhere from weird dark ambience to loose shoegazy rock instrumentals to odd experimental sound effects to pleasant Brian Eno-style melodic ambience. A fair bit darker on average than anything he'd released afterwards, and the Tim Hecker Haunt Me Do It Again structuring turned out to be more interestingly executed than I expected, with all the individual cuts both making sense taking as separate individuals but also as parts of their respective suites. Cool stuff. I think this might be the guy's most popular record. The Boards of Canada parallel is pretty obvious, especially if you hear a track like It's Very Sunny, combining light and fluffy synth melodies, heavy beats, and samples of little kids talking. But his particular execution and presentation of those sonic ingredients doesn't quite sound like something they would do. It's hard to put into words. Also, first appearance of Hawaiian-style guitars, obviously. Now, I actually don't know if I'm too crazy about this one as a whole. It kind of falls off for me in its second half, and there's a surprising amount of cuts which were a bit of an unpleasant drudge and not in an interesting or compelling way like BOC tracks can be. I think his self-titled was better, honestly, but this does have its moments, and in those best moments I can understand exactly where the hype comes from. I feel like this is the real point at which he fully nailed down his unique style, though. The melodies get much more major key and dreamy like the best parts of Go Hawaii, and the listening experience was much more consistent on average. Still fell into the background for me pretty easily, but I enjoyed it anyway. It's quite good. This one probably benefits a decent bit from the extra familiarity of me having reviewed it in depth already, but in my opinion this is easily his best album and it's not close. It may technically just be a collection of various unreleased tracks and sketches that didn't make the cut for his previous albums, but I feel like the extended double album format allowed him to explore his sound even more in depth, bring in a fair bit more variety and more interesting and evocative ideas that the previous albums didn't have to the same extent in order to make the length feel justified. I stand by it being properly great. More the same as the last three albums, but fittingly a bit darker and more nocturnal, and more ambient-centric on average. Things start to get kind of biosphere-ish in a few moments. Pretty solid as well. I can see this one possibly growing on me with more time, if nothing else worth hearing for the track Lake alone. Right, I can't say I was exactly excited to listen to an album with 80 tracks stretching over 3 hours, though I sat through all of it anyway, because fuck it. Now, even if I were forced to break this down in a full video, I would have surprisingly little to say about this album. This is an album entirely made out of mildly pleasant ambient fragments based around processed and reverb-covered guitars, And that's it. I think there were 2 tracks that I noticed using synths. The remaining 78 are all just guitars with effects. Pick any 10 tracks from this thing at random and chances are you'll have heard the full breadth of what this album has to offer. To be fair, so long as you know how to digest lengthy ambient records, this won't be as grueling as it looks, but there's nothing absolutely essential here, it's just alright. Another collection of ambient sketches and languid reverb guitar pieces, but at least this time it's a much more reasonable 73 minutes and has more than 4 song ideas. There's actually a bunch of parts of this one that got much more Tim Hecker-ish, and I fuck with that. Still probably not going to change anyone's life, but it's obviously much easier to recommend than the last one. Which brings us to here. I'll admit I don't know if I was necessarily going into the idea of a new Casino vs. Japan album in 2024 with especially high expectations, but, you know, I wasn't going into it with low expectations either. His catalog can be a little hit and miss for me, and I think the only album of his I properly love was the one I already reviewed before. But most of his stuff is varying shades of good. He has done a good job of maintaining that unique style within this scene and iterating upon it in different ways and evolving that sound over time without ever losing that core appeal or getting to a point where he could easily be mistaken for another artist. I figured this new album could also be interesting because in direct contrast to most of his albums, which typically have loads of shorter tracks, this latest one only has 8 tracks and most of them are on the lengthier side, like 7, 8, or 9 minutes. From structure alone, it looked like this was at least going to be something kinda different for him. However, even if these tracks are longer, that doesn't mean they have more ideas going into them than any given shorter track of his. In fact, as it turns out, the structuring led this to probably become the most minimalistic record in his catalog yet. Each track has one single, very simple sonic idea that gets repeated without really building on it in any way, leaving those single ideas to hopefully be immersive enough to carry themselves. And while the results are not all winners, to be fair, I do think the 8 tracks on display here offer a surprising amount of variety in terms of those ideas. Some of them go in exactly the direction you'd expect. When the album opened up with a sleepy and somewhat droning 9-minute guitar piece in his usual style, I was starting to check out pretty immediately. In my defense, I had listened to this album and written this segment on the same day that I had sat through Frozen Geometry in full, so I was getting a little sick of his guitar pieces. The other 2 standard ambient guitar pieces he includes are better though, have a bit more life put into them with brighter melodies. Heck, Nacht is one of the easy highlights on this thing as the melodies are easily the prettiest of any cut included here. But tracks like those were easy to expect. Where this album starts to get more interesting is some of these other tracks. I might have been able to expect some of the minimal synth doodles like Licht and Strahlucke to show up. They have some mildly pleasant major key melodies but don't really stick out to me that much. But I certainly would not have expected 2 fuzzy minimal techno-ish tracks to show up that feature no melody at all, just sharp percussion going over atonal industrial ambient drones as seen on Schnee, and very dub-heavy tapping noises over a stationary bed of their own reverb on Elektricität. The album also ends in an amelodic drone piece in Fluss that's nothing but very cold and windy ambience. Tracks like these in particular were actually pretty refreshing to get, since I don't know if I've ever heard Casino vs. Japan do anything quite like them before. I think at the end of the day I ended up enjoying this album on the same level that I would a modern-day Biosphere record. The particular super minimalist approach of this thing reminds me of that guy's work a lot, in that even if the ideas going into the album are extremely simplistic and might be a little scattered in quality, there is kind of something interesting about the way these ideas are being juxtaposed into a greater whole. And there is a sense like he's still trying to evolve his sound into new territory, much in the same way no 2 Biosphere albums are exactly the same. I don't foresee myself keeping this album around longer term, and I don't think I'd recommend it to someone looking to first get into Casino vs. Japan. It's not really the most indicative of his overall body of work. If you're more of an IDM fan, I would start with either Whole Numbers Play the Basics or just Hitori plus Kaizo like what I did. And if you're more of an ambient fan, check out either like his self-titled or Suicide by Sun. But if you're already a longtime fan of this guy and were looking to see the latest evolution in his sound, I think this will provide you with something pretty intriguing. And hey, if you're a big Biosphere fan, maybe check this out too. I can see this catering to that kind of audience too. Either way, another pretty good album from this guy. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. And that will finally be everything. That is the roundup. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.